yeah, you have to be brave in this job. You hope that nothing terrible will happen for your family, but on the other hand, you do put yourself out there. And so, it's very rewarding. It truly is. We're always talking about people being happy in their life, and that's a good thing, to be happy. But I think even more important is to be fulfilled, to feel as if you're doing something that you are leaving a mark. You are, maybe not as heroically as Ted Stevens, but you are making a difference in other people's lives.
Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is author and Alaska State Senate President Gary Stevens, whose play, Uncle Ted, about the life of U.S. Senator Ted Stevens, premiered at Cyrano's Theater in Anchorage last week. I was at the opening night, and we discussed the genesis of his play and Gary's relationship with Senator Ted Stevens, as well as Ted's oldest son, Senator Ben Stevens, the three Senator Stevens. Although it is important to note that Gary is not related to Ted or Ben. We also discuss why Gary first came to Kodiak in 1970 and his launch into local politics before completing his PhD in American history. Gary Stevens has held many titles: professor, doctor, school board member, city councilman, assemblyman, Mr. Mayor, representative, Senator, and Mr. President, as President of the Alaska State Senate 3 times. President of the Senate, Gary Stevens, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Andrew, so much. Good to see you.
So you were just mentioning something that I thought was interesting. We're here to talk about your new play, which premiered at Cyrano's Playhouse here in Anchorage on Friday evening, which I saw. Congratulations. Really exciting. Great show.
Oh, thank you.
And you mentioned that you had one person question whether you could write a play as a senator and have your title senator as the playwright. Just curious, let's start right there. Are you able to do it?
Sure. Well, that's an interesting story. I never had a part of doing the program. I wrote the play, and Cyrano decided to do it, and they just did a beautiful job. But at one point, they did a program, and it said Senator Gary Stevens, and so there was a complaint to the ethics committee saying, was the state of Alaska involved? Was the legislature involved? Was there any legislative funds spent? Absolutely not. No, not at all. The only thing would indicate that I was in the legislature was where it says playwright Senator Stevens. So I did check with an attorney on it. They said, no, that's your title, and you can use it whatever you might do in the world. That is a title you carry with you. In fact, it's interesting that the title senator carries with you even after you've left the legislature.
So speaking of Senator Stevens, since we're talking about U.S. Senator Ted Stevens, yes. And you are Alaska State Senator Gary Stevens, I am going to refer to Senator Ted Stevens as Ted, just so we don't have any confusion. Sure. But just for the listeners to know, I am not doing it as any sign of disrespect to the late Senator Ted Stevens.
Absolutely. I understand that. That has always been an issue. Actually, honestly, I think in my elections, I suspect 10, 15, 20% of the public who votes for me thinks they're still voting for Ted.
That is so funny. Since the play really covers all of Ted Stevens' life, I'm going to just throw it out to folks that this play is showing through October 22nd. I don't feel like I need to give any spoiler alerts since it's just telling his life, which anyone can Google and read about. But if you want to see the play, there are things that I didn't know, even as a student of Alaskan history. There was definitely some very interesting tidbits that I hadn't learned.
Sure.
So if you want to have it be a surprise, I recommend that you go see the play by October 22nd and then listen to this interview, because I'm going to start with a question right off the bat that will give part of the play away.
And that's perfectly okay. And I believe that, I appreciate you saying that there are things about his life that you didn't know. And as a professor of history, I taught Alaska history for many years at the university. And I honestly was not totally aware, once I got into the research, of his impact on statehood. I mean, he had an enormous impact. He was a key person. And that really doesn't come across in the history books so much.
You open the play with his death in August 2010. He's narrating at
the spot, we presume, near Bristol Bay, where the plane crashed. And I'm curious, where were you when you found out that his plane had crashed?
Wow, that's a good question. I honestly can't remember, but I do remember the funeral here in town and the sheets with the goodbye Uncle Ted strewn across the roadway on the overpasses. And so I suppose I was home, and I knew Ted in many instances. Probably more through his son, Ben. Ben was Senate president. I was majority leader, so I worked with Ben every day for 2 years. And so I got to know Ted through his son and lots of other things that occurred during my tenure. I was started service in the legislature in 2000, so I dealt with Ted quite a bit.
We're approaching the 100th birthday of Ted Stevens. Yes. So he is a generation above you. It makes more sense. Right. Like Ben Stevens was more your contemporary.
That's true. And and Ted was World War II. My father was World War II. So so they were of that generation. And here we are, one generation following that.
I brought up wondering where you had been when you found out about the plane crash, because another legislator was at the play with me on Friday night. Representative Andy Josephson, and he remembers where he said he could remember exactly where he was when the first plane crash happened in 1978.
Yes, when his wife
was killed. And that's one of those ones that's before my time. Mm-hmm. I was 3 years old in 1978. I didn't know about that part at all.
Right. So
that's one of those tidbits where it gave me a window.
A little perspective.
Yes. Do you remember where you were in 1978 when that plane crash happened?
I was involved. I got to Alaska in 1970, and so I was involved in local politics and chambers of commerce and that sort of thing, and had met Ted a few times, I met his wife actually when they were campaigning, and in Kodiak when he was campaigning, and so my knowledge of him was sort of peripheral at that time up until her death. But of course, dealing with and knowing Ben and his family, that was a disastrous occurrence for his losing a mother at that early age.
Mm-hmm. You have been very active in Kodiak politics, it sounds like, really from the moment you arrived.
Pretty close.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about how you got to Kodiak and then what led you to your initial involvement in local politics?
Sure. Actually, sort of a long story, and cut out what you don't want, but I was working on my doctorate at UCLA and got my master's at the University of Oregon and started my doctorate at UCLA. And I wanted to become a history professor. And actually was drafted into the Army at that time during Vietnam, and went through basic training and combat training, and then chose to go on to Officers Canada School, and then was a commissioned officer, and then became an Army intelligence officer. So that was my experience with the military. And after I ended that, after 3 years in the Army, I was going to go back to get my doctorate at UCLA, and my family owned a small cannery in Kodiak. So I said, well, I'll come up for the summer, earn a lot of money, and then go back to graduate school. But what in fact happened is my family pretty much left and said, you're in charge. So I ran the company for 5 years before I went back and went to the university.
And you got your doctorate 80 to 82 or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah, I was teaching and took a sabbatical teaching at Kodiak College and University, and took a sabbatical, went back to spend a year in Oregon and finish up my classwork. You
were on city council, though, in that period in between?
Well, not when I was gone.
Okay.
I did in my term. So I was on city council, school board in between, and then the borough assembly. So experienced all of the local government, except for the electric board. Other than that, I pretty much spent 13 years learning local politics.
How did your family come to own that cannery in the first place?
Oh, well, actually, my stepfather was a Washington State fisherman, crab fisherman, and became a processor there, and then built several processing plants in Alaska. His name was Roy Fuford. He was really quite a historic figure, and built canneries throughout Alaska, and was very successful. Just a wonderful person. Just really was lucky to have him as a stepfather.
I want to talk about your childhood, and I'll
Sure.
I'll talk about it within the realm of the play.
Sure.
So when you focused in the play a little bit on his aunt, who seemed to be a hard driving. So Ted's aunt was a hard driving, pretty strict mother figure in his life. That I felt what you were getting at was that some of his hard-driven nature throughout his life may have been born in the expectations of his aunt.
Well, I think it's exactly true. Several times Ted mentioned that he had a hard childhood. He truly did. His father lost his job during he was an accountant, lost his job during the Depression. They moved back to his grandfather's home in Indianapolis, and Ted had a hard life. He was always expected to work, and he did. And then his Aunt Gladys, his mother sort of left the family, moved to California, did bring the kids to California eventually. So it was, in a way, a dysfunctional family, I think. And I think that really developed Ted's close relationship with his own family. I mean, he was a good father and a good father figure. And Aunt Gladys really was demanding and pushed him to do things. I mean, take jobs, and didn't want him to go in the military because of the war, but he was determined, so he went anyway. But they always had a close relationship. And in fact, after Anne's death, he takes the children back to California to spend Christmas with his aunt.
So in the play, there's a scene where Ted Stevens on the Senate floor confronts another senator, a senator who made a promise to allow an amendment to come up, and it was moving to a vote. The amendment had to come up. He confronts him. He uses some curse words. The president of the Senate calls a point of order, says that we're not going to speak like this.
Right.
Ted's able to express the situation. The president of the Senate says, "Is this true?" They bring the amendment up. The amendment passes, I think, unanimously.
Ted, I think throughout the play, I think you see that he had some anger issues, and he did explode and blow up several times to different people. I think it's really quite interesting that he did that, because he was able to control that, and you learn that he really makes use of that, losing his temper. Mm-hmm. And one line is, "I don't lose my temper. I know where it is all the time. I can always find it." Yeah. So. Ted, I think that's a major issue. And he does mention often that he's not a perfect person. None of us are. He made mistakes.
The joke that comes out of that is that he observed at the president of the Senate this very measured, calm, reasonable response, and something along the lines of, like, that's who I want to be. And everyone, of course, laughs because that's not who he is. But you know what I thought? I thought, but that's who Gary Stevens strikes me as. And so to kind of try to meld those two questions together, did you have any childhood experiences that, in the way that Aunt Gladys shaped Ted Stevens, did you have any childhood experiences that made you the type of senator that Ted Stevens was not?
Well, I had a very close family, a good childhood, and a good, extended grandparents. So I really grew up in a loving family. The only grandchild for the first 15 years of my life, so I really doted upon.
So were you an only child?
I was an only child, and then other grandchildren were born much, much later. So, I think, what's interesting about a play, how do you separate me from Ted?
Right.
We have common experiences and common interests, and of course the truth of the matter is that I had to write a lot of words that Ted did not say. I mean, we can't go back and find out what he thought about riding his tricycle. We just don't know. There's no record of that. The only record we really have that really is sound are his speeches. 3 beautiful speeches he wrote during his time in office towards the end of his career. So you extrapolate from that. You try to be true to the person and don't do anything that would not fit with his experience and his personality. But anger was an issue that he did address often, and you're right. The audience laughs when he says, "I've got to be like this guy," because he's calm and collected. The audience laughed at that, knowing that was not really Ted, and he had to say, "Well, listen, I work on it." But one thing I should mention too is that Ted had anger issues, I suppose, and he would blow up at things and use his temper, but he was never that way with his children, as far as I know. I mean, he was a very, very strong family figure, and In fact, one of the keys in the play, I think, is that you see that Ted is talking about, I want to make a mark in my life. I want to accomplish things, and like his father and like his grandfather, he really wanted to leave a list of accomplishments and really make a mark in life. And at the end of the play, you realize that the mark he leaves is his family.
Well, you mentioned that your relationship was with Ben. Did Ben have a temper? Was Ben different than his father? Or?
Ben was different than his father. Sometimes he spoke off the handle, and he offended a lot of people occasionally, but just a very, very fine person. You got involved in some things that he probably shouldn't have, and so it led to him, not. I always believe that Ben could have been a governor or a U.S. senator, but at the end of his life, he really withdrew from politics. But Ben was a fine person, and just really thought the world of him. And it is a shame that he didn't live to see the play. He read 3 scripts.
Ben did.
Yeah, as I was going through the various variations of the script, he read 3 different scripts and was very supportive of the project. And actually, at one time he said, well, I look like my dad, and I sound like my dad, and I should play my dad. And I said, Ben, what a wonderful idea, but you can't act. And Ben said, oh, wait a minute, I've been acting all my life. Well, clearly, it would not have worked out. But I would love to have heard Ben read the script aloud. That would have been a great experience. And it was just a shock to me when he died at such an early age.
It was a shock.
I got a photograph that we may not get to talk about this, but maybe mention it now. I've got a photograph of Ben and Ted and myself coming into the joint House and Senate for Ted's annual speech. And so what happened is that Terrio was president of the Senate, and Ben had been appointed by the governor, and then I had been in the House, and I was appointed by the governor to a vacant seat. So both Ben and I were in the Senate. And so Terrio, as president, called the House and the Senate order, and he said, so would Senator Stevens and Senator Stevens please escort Senator Stevens in?
Oh, that's so funny.
I don't remember ever there being 3 folks with the same last name. That had been 2 at various times. But so the 3 of us, same last name. And so we go out, Ben and I go out to pick up Ted, and on the way out, Ben said to me, this is like the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You're the good Stevens. I'm the bad Stevens. But who's going to tell my dad he's the ugly one? And certainly would not have been me. I was not about to say that. Anyway, that was a great moment, I thought. And so I got that photograph in my office, and I think of it often that of the 3 of us, only one of us is still standing. And I thought, if anyone's going to write this play, I better do it.
You were older than Ben.
Yes, by probably 15 or 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
One of the things that I didn't know about that is kind of a big tidbit, I think, was the election for Ernest Greening's seat.
Yes.
Where Mike Gravel won the Democratic nomination and Elmer Rasmussen won the Republican nomination.
Right.
Mike Gravel was elected.
Right.
Bob Bartlett died.
Exactly.
And then Wally Hickel, governor, chose Ted Stevens, who had lost the Republican nomination to Elmer Rasmussen.
Right.
And so, and of course, as it's in the play, it's a big deal. Ted Stevens was sworn in 10 days before Mike Gravel and became the senior senator, the title he held for 40 years.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great story. Bartlett was so well respected. Someone should write a better story about Bartlett's life. But Bartlett was really a great U.S. senator for us. He surprisingly died during heart surgery. And so Hickel was governor, and he had the opportunity to decide who's going to follow it, who's going to appoint. At that time, the governor makes that appointment. That's all there is to it. And as you say, Rasmussen had won the primary, the Republican primary, but there was bad blood between the Rasmussens and the Hickels for a long time. So Hickel did choose to appoint Ted, who had lost twice in running for a U.S. Senate race, and I think it sort of shocked Ted. But Hickel does say that I'm going to put Ted in there because he will do what I tell him to do. And of course, we realize that Ted is not going to do what anyone tells him to do. He's going to be his own person. And I think they remained friends throughout their lives until both of them died. But they worked well together. And then I think the big shock, of course, is to realize that Gravel, who had a bit of an ego, if you remember, and actually Ted says that Gravel is a show horse while Ted sees himself as a workhorse. So they had some differences. And I'm sure it's true that Gravel was quite upset when he found that Ted became the senior senator for 40 years.
One thing that I thought about that is if Elmer Rasmussen, who may have felt entitled to that seat, had been appointed, he couldn't have served 40 years.
Right.
Because he passed away in 2000 at the age of 90 or 91. He was just so much older than Ted Stevens. So there was really, by Wally Hickel appointing someone as young as Ted Stevens, it enabled Ted Stevens to serve as long as he did.
Right. And I'm sure that was in Hickel's mind, that if he appointed Ted, he'd be there for a long time. And of course, seniority in the U.S. Senate is extremely important. It really helps a lot in getting projects for your state. And Ted was never embarrassed about getting projects for Alaska.
I want to talk, we're kind of talking about his last year, going, to the 40 years that he served. And it did end because of a scandal. There's no way around it. If the scandal hadn't happened, he would have won re-election.
Sure.
And I I did an interview with someone who'd run a blog about the Ted Stevens scandal. And I remember when I did that interview, I didn't really know the details very well. And as they were being explained to me, I was like, what? Because even to me, and a Democrat, like listening to the story, I was like, there was a recliner? He accepted a recliner? There was maybe some work that he didn't pay for? It just seemed like such small potatoes for someone to lose their entire career.
Well, exactly, and actually that is one of the concerns that has been expressed to me, that Ted was much more than the trial. He left a great experience and accomplishments, and if the trial had not occurred, he would still have been a great Alaskan. But the trial did occur, and Ted was hurt by it and damaged by it. So I can understand when people say, yeah, that was not a key issue in his life, but it was, because he lost the election after serving 40 years. Half of Alaskans said, we don't want you as our U.S. Senator. That had to be tough. Actually, I met Ted some months after he lost his election, after he left the Senate. He was in D.C., and I was there for some meetings and had a chance to sit down and chat with him. He seemed really old. He seemed really depressed. He was wearing old man shoes and just looked different than he did when he was at his height as a powerful senator. So you can say that that was the trial was not Ted, that he was much more than that. But in reality, I think he did feel that he lost his reputation at the trial, and he was unelected, even though a poll later showed that he would have won the next election. Right.
Well, I think part of that is that we're looking at it, for me at least, I'm looking at it through a lens of 2023.
Right.
And what's a scandal today? It was probably unimaginable. Right. Some of the things that have happened in the last few years. I'm curious if you've thought about what Ted Stevens would say about the state of American politics today.
Well, I think he would have been upset with some of the things that are going on. Is it Senator Mendez?
Yes.
Those issues are out there, and and I don't think he's going to resign Menendez because that's sort of expressing guilt, and he wants to go to trial. And though I suspect that things are not going to turn out well for him, I don't know where Ted would have been on some of these issues, but he was so dedicated to Alaska. I think he would have done anything to make sure that Alaska got what it deserved.
I had a low bar for the play. I knew it was a one-man show, and I knew it was going to talk about Ted Stevens' life. And so I went in expecting, this is going to be a man sitting in a chair for 2 hours, just talking. And so I went in being like, this might be very boring. So I want to tell listeners, that is not what it is. It is not. The actor's incredible, does a wonderful job of, and there's there's not sitting in a chair. There's no sitting in a chair. He's up and about the entire play.
Right.
So I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, it's very hard for an actor to do a one-person show. There have been several successful actors who've done various things over the years, actors and actresses who've done a monologue. It's very difficult to carry a show for an hour and a half, which this actor does. He does a wonderful job. But as a writer, you try to put things in there that keeps people's attention, that brings some action, that has things going on. A little thing is like the car going across the continent. I remember that from my childhood. Going to movies, you see something like that. Watch the ball, and that sort of thing. And so you add things like that to bring, keep the audience involved, to keep the audience interested, to keep the actor in motion and doing things. And this actor is just supremely talented and really carries that show. I was shocked that I would find it hard to memorize an hour and a half of dialogue.
Well,
but he did.
What I thought is, man, this guy. He came from New York.
Right.
He's an Morrison. Is his last name?
Yes, Dan Morrison. He's an equity actor. He is professional, and he just launched right into it.
And he now knows a lot of Alaskan history.
That's true. One of the problems he had, of course, somebody coming from out of state, is that is it greening or gruening? Or is it,
Well, when he said, Kuskokwim, and he has to pronounce a lot of words, and he did a good job.
Well, we worked with him. The director worked with him on it to try to make sure that he had all the words down. We in Alaska, we know them all, so it's not a problem for us. But I was trying to think the pronunciation of Accutan, when he first said it, he just really destroyed it. We got it right, but we in Alaska, we know those words like greening and gruening. We know those things.
The climax for me is when the actor delivers Ted Stevens' final Senate floor speech.
Yes,
it's very emotional, and I think through my personal lens watching it, it's a good. It reminds us that underneath all these politicians is a person. This is a person.
That's right.
And I think today, and I hate to, you're a history professor. You know history. We love to talk about how everything is worse today than it's ever been. And historically, there have been a lot of terrible times in human history. So I think to say that politicians today experience more vitriol than at any point in history, that may not be true.
No.
But I think that for those of us in politics today, we do experience some vitriol. And I think for me watching that, you see the person, Ted Stevens. And I don't know if you could speak to that, about the way politicians sometimes become a two-dimensional object for people to scream and shout.
I think that's true. And I think in his life, he experienced a lack of understanding by the public. They heard some bad things, so they assumed they were true. They heard that he was involved maybe in some financial issues and assumed they were true. They heard that he was involved in this Bill Allen thing and assumed those issues were true. When in fact, they were not so important, I think, at the time. So, Ted really wrote some beautiful speeches. And at one time, early on, I had the three speeches, when he spoke to becoming Senate President Pro Tem, a beautiful speech, and very long. Then when his last speech to the court, after he was found innocent, a very long speech. And then the third speech was when his last speech to the Senate. So three very beautiful speeches that I really encourage people to read them. I mean, they are wonderful. I had to cut them. I had to edit Ted Stevens because it would have been a long and boring, evening to hear, an hour and a half of just a speech. But so I did pick and choose some of the things out of that. He handled that vitriol well, I believe. All he says at one point that even his patriotism was questioned, and I think I see that in my experience. People misunderstand what you're doing. They're looking for you to make a mistake often. Some people, and others just say, we elected you, we trust you, and do your job.
Well, I could be wrong here, but I assume that your constituents, your personal constituents, for the most part, are grateful and thankful for where you stand and what you're representing. But there is a lot of vitriol from certain wings of the Republican Party in Alaska regarding the Senate coalition. So I'm sure that you've experienced some vitriol.
Oh, absolutely. And it was shocking, actually. I mean, I've always been a Republican. I always will be a Republican. I believe in those basic ideas. But this last election, the party endorsed my opponent. And they invited me to come down to a Republican fundraiser before the session started and asked me to introduce the 4 new senators. All of us had been opposed by the party,
Wow.
All of us had been. So, and that's really a shock to hear that happen. I think the party, not just my party, maybe all parties, have gone to extremes, and they need to ratchet it back to the center. I'm a great fan of President Reagan. I love his speeches. I appreciate his job as governor. And I was a student at UCLA. He was governor, and his job as president. He was a centrist, and he always said, "It's a big tent. You don't want to become so extreme that you leave people out." So that's an issue we're facing nationally right now. I don't know where it's going. I just hope that we can get beyond that and get back to some basics that bring people together. So yeah, you're right. I mean, in my life, when I was Senate President the last 10 years ago, for 4 years, I was Senate President, it was a coalition. We had 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats, and the only way you're going to get to a majority is to bring in both parties. So that's what I've done, and I was berated by far right people because of that. And that's the territory we live in.
Well, yesterday, we're recording this on Sunday, October 1st. Yesterday, we averted a federal government shutdown.
Yes.
Because Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, got 209 Democratic votes.
Exactly.
And I don't know, because I guess I like to scratch at scabs. I went to a far-right blog in Alaska to see how they were covering it and read the comments. And there were a lot of comments from folks saying that by him working with Democrats, he is now no longer trustworthy. We know that anyone who works with Democrats is, in effect, not a real Republican. And so I don't think that's a mainstream. I don't think that's what the average person. I think the average person wants to see cooperation,
right,
and wants to see their government move forward. But there is this oversized influence from some folks on both sides who do not want to see cooperation. And I don't know. Do you see it as like a team sport thing that they want to see their team win? Is it? Or what, why is there?
It's sort of shocking where we are, isn't it? And, McCarthy could lose his job. But I think as a politician, as you are and I am, you do what you think is right. And if you lose your job, you lose your job. There's worse things in the world. There are worse things in the world than losing an election.
We started off by talking, this is before we started recording, we talked a little bit about your political work at the local level, and how you wish that more folks in the legislature had that experience of school board, city council, borough assembly, mayor. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of being involved in local politics?
Sure, absolutely. I've seen folks come into the legislature with absolutely no background in local politics, and so they're really not really sure who they are working for. But once you're in local government, particularly for me, the school board, I realized that who my constituents were and who my supporters were and what was important to me. And so education and fisheries have always been the key issues in all of my service in the legislature.
So I got involved in politics at the local level. I never held local elected office other than community council, as we have in Anchorage.
That's very big in Anchorage.
It is very big in Anchorage. And one thing that I've observed at just one session in the House, because I still am very close with a lot of local officials, is how much local officials can bristle when they see op-eds, comments, social media posts by legislators in Juneau about issues in at the local level that those legislators aren't involved in and aren't really participating in, and yet want to appear involved in. And I don't know if as somebody who was involved in local government, if you know what those local officials are are experiencing or feeling?
Now, I know what you're talking about, and I have always tried to steer clear of local issues. A lot of things are not on our bailiwick in the legislature. It has to happen at the local level. So, I have a community sewer that's going through a big argument about whether they should sell the electric generation plant, and it's about halfway. Half people on one side, half people on the other side. It's not for me to tell them what to do. Not at all. They have to decide that. So I think, I think Ted experienced that as well. And just one story I'll share with you that was really important to me. I never found a place to put it in a play, but I was at years ago at a big AFN conference here in town, and in an auditorium probably with a couple hundred people, and Ted was giving a speech on what he was doing, and a elderly native woman got up to speak, and she was concerned about FAS and FAE in the villages, fetal alcohol syndrome, and what she said is, we have an enormous problem with fetal alcohol syndrome in my village, and you're a United States Senator. What are you going to do about it? And Ted's response was, no, my dear, what are you going to do about it? Which really told me at the time that there's some things I can't do. As you know, there are a lot of things we simply cannot do as legislators. If anyone is going to stop your daughters from drinking alcohol when they're pregnant, it has to be the family, the village. It can't be a U.S. senator, and it can't be a state legislator.
Well, they tried it at the federal level, prohibition. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have tried it. It didn't work out.
No.
You started the education committee.
Right. Yes. So I was, involved in the Council of State Governments as a national organization, and also occasionally in NCSL, National Conference of Legislators. And I noticed that most states, I was always involved in education committees there. I noticed that most states had a separate education committee. At that time, ours was with HES, Health, Education, Social Services. And I was on HES, but we never had time to talk about education. We were always dealing with the bigger issues, the biggest, most expensive part of government was dealing with health and social services. And so education sort of took a back seat. So I did write the legislation to create a standing Senate House committee. Occasionally there was a House Special Committee on Education that Senator Bundy, or Representative Bundy at the time, chaired. But I thought it was important that we have a standing committee separate from everything else. And that has really been important and successful. And it deals with not only K through 12, but also the University of Alaska. So education, to me, has always been crucial. And I think to most Alaskans, if we don't do anything right, we've got to do education right,
And you taught history at the university level?
I did. I taught for actually 25 and a half years at the University of Alaska, and was near retirement, and ran for the House, elected to the House, and then retired. So I wanted to make sure I was busy one way or the other. And I love teaching at the university. I love my students. But honestly, I thought that I would miss it a lot more than I have. And I haven't, because this is education as well.
Right.
I mean, you're dealing with other legislators, trying to help them to understand what you're working with. They trying to make you understand what they are working on. And I had actually a former Senate president said to call the Senate, the legislator, the learning factory.
Yeah.
I really like that. It is a learning factory.
Did you have a particular area of history that you focused on as a student, as a teacher?
Honestly, mostly American history and history of the West. But then, towards the end of my career as a professor, I was mostly teaching Alaska history, which was really interesting because I love it. I love the Russian-American period, and really enjoyed studying. I didn't take Alaska history anywhere. I went to the University of Oregon; they didn't offer it, but so I had to become up to speed on it. And one thing I should mention is that in doing the research on this play, honestly, I did not know Ted's full involvement in statehood. He was a key person, and I knew he was involved, but I didn't know he wrote so much of the legislation that he satisfied President Eisenhower on the PIC line. And so I think there was a lot to learn there. So even I, who was teaching history of Alaska, didn't really fully understand the impact he had, because that was before I was involved in politics.
Well, I think it is pointed out in the play that at the time, Alaska was seen as a Democratic state, and Hawaii was a Republican state.
Exactly.
And so with a Republican president, I think having Republicans involved and being crucially involved would be important for getting the Republican president to sign this democratic territory into statehood.
Exactly. Now, isn't that odd that Hawaii was Republican, Alaska was Democratic, and now we've switched entirely. And it was towards the end then that, because Hawaii had a lot more complex issues, we were a little simpler, and so we became a state and we sort of pulled Hawaii on. And the key thing for Eisenhower was not to lose the one-person majority he had in the Senate. Mm-hmm. So by bringing both Hawaii and Alaska in, he kept that. Another issue that Ted does explain during the play is the fact that Alaska, with under 500,000 people, had 2 U.S. senators, where say, California, with 20 million, still had 2 U.S. senators. So he thought it'd be easier to become a senator in Alaska than anywhere else, but it wasn't
the case. The same power.
The same power, yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Did you find that in his writings in the journal? How did you find that?
He mentioned it briefly, when he decided he wanted to be in the U.S. Senate. He decided that before his last move back to Alaska, when he opened a law office here in Anchorage and convinced his wife to come back. And he knew at that time that he was eventually going to run for U.S. Senate.
Well, that's I think a very memorable moment for me in the play, because it seems premeditated. Mm-hmm. I'm going to move to this very small state because I have a chance of becoming a senator and having this power. And of course, that's what he did. There were accidents of luck along the way, right, getting appointed.
Well, I think that was a part of, in his mind at least, and there are other Alaska politics that have had that same theory.
For sure.
Not all have been successful in the end, but he was.
As a history professor, as someone who's focused on American history, do you have any thoughts about certain states that are changing their history curriculum? I guess Florida comes to mind, to take out anything that and this is me grossly generalizing, things that would make students uncomfortable or students unhappy.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about book banning. I think kids are going to choose the books they want to choose, and if you don't have it in the library, they're going to find it elsewhere. It just really sort of causes me heartache when I hear that certain books are being banned. Actually, as a student at the University of Oregon, working in my master's and my doctorate there, every year the university bookstore would have a display of all the books banned in Oregon, and there were some beautiful books. Catcher in the Rye.
I think it helps the sales.
Yeah,
banning the book does help the sales.
Right. So I'm concerned. The issue of there's so many issues out there that we're dealing with when you look at Florida and the things they're going through. I think there's a more rational approach in Alaska. A Senate that now has a majority made up of Democrats and Republicans. You're not going to see anything nutty happen here, I don't believe.
Sort of getting towards the end of our time, you mentioned in the show notes that you had considered writing a biography of Ted Stevens.
Right.
That you feel that biography really needs to be written. You made the choice to do a play. Do you have any thoughts of going back and doing the biography?
No, I don't. Actually, last night, Steve Hickox was at the production, and I made a point in the notes as we were talking about after the play that maybe Steve should write that.
I was at an event this morning, and he was sitting next to me.
He's a great writer and has done some great things. His histories are just quite wonderful. And as I was researching it, became very clear to me that this was such a dramatic life, not like my life, not like your life, I suspect. Right. But the fact that so much happened, and the plane crashes, and his experience in the military, and he just led a very exciting life. And I just thought it fit theater more than it did for me to spend a lot of time working on a biography. And honestly, I'm thinking about other plays I'd like to do, maybe that rather than historical research, but they deal with history, but they really belong to theater, I think.
And in summary, looking at you, Gary Stevens, who was school board, city council, mayor of Kodiak, later of borough mayor, House of Representatives, senator, president of the Senate, twice. It's a lot.
3 times now.
3 times, sorry. 3 times president of the Senate. Excuse me. it's not, it's definitely different than Ted Stevens, but you have dedicated your life to public service. You've been a politician for 50 years. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you to politics in the first place and what it's meant to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Andrew. So I think my first exposure growing up in Oregon, the high school YMCA always did an annual mock legislature, and we certain students were selected and went from every high school and went to Salem and ran a mock legislature. I was I think I was the deputy Speaker of the House. So it was a great experience to be in the Capitol in Oregon and see what it's all about. And I frankly always knew from that point on I would probably wind up being in a legislature. Yeah, I think for me, it's being true to yourself, being honest, not promising something you can't deliver, and just doing your best and being honest about it.
How do you encourage folks who are reluctant to run for office?
Well, it is difficult. You are putting yourself out there, and people take pot shots at you, and more than that. I mean, people say terrible things. I mean, I had a guy once call my office and said, "I know where you live, and I'm going to hunt you down like the dog that you are." Well, this is the guy that didn't have the nerve to leave his house, probably. But so you put up with that, and then you see occasionally there are events in our history, the United States, where someone is killed or are shot at or pays the price. You have to be brave in this job. You hope that nothing terrible will happen for your family, but on the other hand, you do put yourself out there. And so, it's very rewarding. It truly is. We're always talking about people being happy in their life, and that's a good thing, to be happy. But I think even more important is to be fulfilled, to feel as if you're doing something that you are leaving a mark. You are, maybe not as heroically as Ted Stevens, but you are making a difference in other people's lives by what you do.
Did you discover any interesting books while researching the play that you could recommend?
Yeah, there's a good book by Whitehead, really a former professor, retired at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and I can't think of the title of the book, but he wrote about the Hawaii, Alaska coming in, and really exposed that whole issue to me that as I said, I was not aware of very much, really.
And since the name of our podcast is the East Anchorage Book Club podcast, do you have any books in general? I mean, as a professor of history, any books that you want folks to read?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, a team of rivals would come right to the top there about Lincoln's choice of appointing folks who opposed him. And I think that's important, to bring in people that you may not necessarily agree with. I have a majority caucus now in the Senate that we don't agree on everything, certainly not. But we moderate each other. And I suppose like Senator Wielechowski, we and I would, a lot of things we don't agree on, but we can work together and we can make sure that we have a successful year.
Well, Mr. President, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate it.
The two books recommended by our guest, Gary Stevens, are Completing the Union, Alaska, Hawaii, and the Battle for Statehood by John Whitehead, and Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Gary Stevens' play is showing at Cyrano's through October 22nd. There is a link to buy tickets in the show notes. And thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub